There are many video games throughout history that could easily be described as milestones, from the first video games like a tennis simulator to more modern achievements like Half-Life 2 and Grand Theft Auto 5. One game in particular became well known as the game that would kill PCs back in 2007. Funny how times have changed, because this game could probably be run by anyone nowadays, but it still holds its place in gaming history, especially PC gaming. That's right, grab your nano suits and prepare for some maximum fun as I review the original Crysis for PC. I'll start out with a bit of a confession. Since all the hype was towards the graphics, I kinda thought that meant the gameplay wouldn't be especially noteworthy, and at best it would just be a generic first-person shooter that only looks pretty. I'm pleased to report that I was wrong, and once I really started getting into it, it proved to be an absolute blast. Before I get into the real nitty-gritty though, I'll start with the basics. In many ways, it really is a modern-esque first-person shooter. Mainly you have a weapon limit and regenerating health. You actually get 4 slots, but it's not so straightforward. There's a slot for pistols, 1 for explosives, and 2 for other types of guns. One interesting addition over other games, though, is that you can add attachments to just about any of your main guns. This includes things like laser sights, flashlights, a variety of different types of scopes from sniper to simple iron sight, and a silencer in some cases. You can even put things on them that would be absolutely counterintuitive, like a sniper scope on a shotgun. Moreover, I wouldn't consider the flashlight especially vital since you have night vision. I suppose it's handy if you don't want the game to be covered in green and want to appreciate the nice visuals. But enough about the typical shooty stuff. The real meat of the game is your suit powers. They come in 4 different flavors to suit your need and are all tied to 1 regenerating suit meter. You might call it a stamina bar, or maybe not. You get maximum strength, maximum speed, maximum armor, and just cloak. It's kinda funny to me how cloak is the odd one out, not having maximum in the name, but it's not like humans naturally have a cloak power. We're not exactly chameleons after all. Perhaps the most straightforward is maximum strength. As expected, it's sort of like a berserk pack from Doom, boosting your arm strength immensely. Naturally, your fists are supercharged, and you can also easily grab enemies to use as meat shields or just yeet them at your leisure. Of course, it's not just for arm strength, it actually factors into your traversal too. The reason being is because it supercharges all of your muscles, and this includes your legs. You gain Mario-styled super jumping, allowing you to hop along sections of the terrain clearly made with it in mind. Naturally, swinging your fist or jumping consumes suit power. Maximum armor is a 100% passive effect that you have no control over at all. It simply happens automatically when you're fired at, serving as body armor in any game and draining suit power to absorb some of the damage you'd have taken. It can be handy when you're in a pinch, but the drain on suit power will leave you hard-pressed for other options if you're in the middle of a firefight, since it happens automatically. Basically, use it if you don't plan on using other suit powers at the moment and just want some extra protection while you're shooting stuff. Maximum speed is a pretty fun one if you're a fan of old-school shooters or the scout from Team Fortress 2. It passively buffs your walking speed, but the real draw of it is it gives you a super sprint when you hold the run button. The passive, of course, doesn't drain suit power, but the super sprint does. Interestingly, it starts with a super fast sprint that burns through energy in a flash, but as it gets low, it switches to a slightly slower sprint that drains it far less rapidly. It's sort of like a phone switching into power save mode. I found myself using this one quite often to get out of danger. Of course, I also tended to combine it with another suit power, the only one I haven't talked about yet. Yep, last but not least, it's the cloak power. Turn it on and it camouflages you Predator style, draining suit power constantly. If you aren't doing anything, the drain is actually quite slow, so it can be very useful to regenerate your health in peace or just set enemies up for an ambush. Moving around drains at a faster rate, and if you actually shoot your gun with it on, it instantly drains all of your suit power. For this reason, I recommend you switch it to something else before firing. One thing I really loved doing was using cloak to set up for an ambush, quickly shift to speed, shoot all the enemies I can, and then hightail it out of there. Then I'd wait for the suit to recharge, cloak all over again, and repeat the process. I called it the family business since it's like I'm both a spy and scout from Team Fortress 2. If suit power runs out in cloak, you automatically switch to armor. As I mentioned before, this can make it very tricky allowing it to regenerate if you're in the middle of a firefight, so I suggest switching it yourself before that happens, or just as it happens. Really though, whatever combination of suit powers you use is up to you, and there's probably merit to any of them, even if you just want to use armor and shoot everything. In what's probably the climax of the game, where you enter an alien ship actually has you flying around in zero gravity. Honestly, that part was really fun for me, utilizing the maximum speed and maximum strength to try to punch out the aliens all around. Still, though, I was really grateful to get my guns back, as fighting bare-fisted wasn't the easiest thing in the world. If there was one part of the game that really annoyed me, though, it was the moment after when you're in the snow. A companion is at risk of frostbite, so you have to get him near fires quickly. If the bar ran cold, it's game over. So as usual, if there's an escort mission, you can guarantee it's probably going to be the most annoying part of the game. Thankfully, its short length and quick saves help reduce the sting a bit. Another little criticism I'd have is when you were basically forced into a tank. Since you lack suit powers, the movements are a lot clunkier and the tank doesn't regenerate its health. It didn't happen too often. I think you could have played it on foot, but it still wasn't one of my favorite moments. Surprisingly, though, there was actually one moment where you're piloting a flying aircraft. While it had arguably some of the same issues as the tank, being able to fly around is pretty fun. As for weapons, I'll focus on the weapons you can pick for your 2 non-specific slots. The SCAR is basically the American weapon, and while it's powerful, ammo is very scarce, so not recommended for the long term. It kinda makes sense, after all, you're not exactly going to find ammo specific for an American weapon in NK territory. The FY-71, on the other hand, is the tool of the trade of the NKs. It's not as powerful, but you're going to find it quite often for obvious reasons, and one handy bonus is you can fit a grenade launcher attachment to it. The shotgun, of course, is what I gravitated towards, and it's obviously very effective up close. You can cloak to get close to an enemy, and then you can really put the smack down on them with its close-ranged effectiveness. There's also a submachine gun, and it's pretty good in some cases, but I generally didn't use that much since you need to devote a slot to it. You get the Gauss cannon later on, and it packs quite a punch, essentially being a railgun of sorts. Limited ammo though, so only use it if absolutely necessary. You can also get a minigun, which is quite the ultimate shredder, but it obviously chews through ammo as quickly as enemies, so don't spam it too much. You can also get an alien lure that essentially functions like a portable turret gun. As in, it has unlimited ammo and starts up immediately, but it also has cooldown. On the subject of turrets, funnily enough, they also exist in the game, and there's at least one section where it's mandatory. On the whole, Crysis can best be described as somewhat semi-linear in its gameplay, at least when you're on the island. It gives you the illusion of wide open spaces, but you're really headed towards one specific location marked on your map. However, you often get at least a few options on how to get there. For instance, one area early on allows you to head along the beach, go along the road and through some small settlements, or just hijack a boat and go straight there. Just bear in mind that the game will enforce its bubbles. Stray too far in the water and a shark will gnaw on you, or a distant ship will launch inescapable missiles at you. It essentially serves the same purpose as the killer leeches in Half-Life 2, giving you a hindrance to getting out of the allowed space without blatantly telling you Call of Duty style that you're leaving the mission area. One thing I'd like to touch upon is just how much of the environment is destructible. No, you can't punch holes in the terrain Red Faction style, but you can at least shoot down trees or knock over sections of small buildings. This can either be used to your advantage or to your enemy's advantage if you decide to hide out and they've got some explosives on hand. Speaking of explosives, one hazard you'll be facing in the game is landmines, and I learned the hard way they can be quite tricky to maneuver around, so be careful. Your enemies are mostly soldiers, of course, but soon they'll have their own replicas of your nanosuit to increasing levels of proficiency. Late game, you even have to take on aliens, and they can be quite dangerous if you underestimate them. They seem to be able to hear you or otherwise detect you in some ways beyond sight, as I've had times where I thought I was cloaked and one just smacks me. Of course, if enemies prove to be too much for you, or you just want to take things a bit slower and measured, you can often stealth through areas. One interesting thing for the FY-71 is that there's also the option to pop on a tactical attachment for paralyzing darts. I never really used it myself, but at least it has infinite ammo if you just want to go around knocking enemies out. Of course, there's a cooldown for use, and knocked out enemies can reawaken Metal Gear Solid style, so don't get too reckless with it. You can also use binoculars to scope out an area if you want to get a better idea of what you're up against. Basically, if you want to take a slow, more strategic route, the game is all too happy to accommodate you. Be very careful around helicopters, though. Those things seem to have the uncanny ability to hover around your location even when you're cloaked. I swear, it feels like they're cheating sometimes with the way they seem to follow you even if you're cloaked, but at least they don't tend to fire if you're invisible, so you can catch your breath and regen some health. In short, Crysis has better gameplay than you may think at first glance. Not just in terms of suit powers, but the gun attachments and the different ways you can handle an area. The game trusts you to use your own judgment on how you want to get the job done. As I mentioned in my Zelda Breath of the Wild review, I love when a game gives you some toys and leaves it up to you to decide how you want to do things, especially if there's different approaches than just which identical fully automatic gun you want to use. It's a solid shooter with some ridiculously fun suit powers in a world that's just open enough to encourage you to experiment a little bit. It also changed things up just enough to prevent it from being stale, and I honestly had a blast with it once I got a rhythm going. Having played it on hard, it definitely made me sweat, but it never really felt unfair. There were sections I was less than a fan of course, mostly the tanks, but that didn't really bog down the game as a whole for me. What I'm saying is gameplay gets my approval, and for the most part it was maximum thrills. I'm gonna guess that not too many people care if I really spoil the plot of a 2007 military shooter. Anyone who does, though, I've got the time code for presentation in the description. You won't hurt my feelings for skipping this part. Basically, it starts out as an attack on the island with a conflict with, let's call them NK, because I get the feeling YouTube is gonna slap me hard if I say the full name. You know what I'm referring to, Anyway, what starts out as a conflict with NK ends up with an entire alien invasion. Well, okay, that's not really much of a spoiler. They tease aliens pretty early on. It becomes pretty obvious that NK human soldiers couldn't be entirely behind it. To go into a bit more detail, your guy named Nomad is sent with a team to investigate this island, but you're hit by something and separate, crash landing in the process. The suit power quickly being restored, you, the Nomad, have to try to get your bearings on things. The first real tragedy occurs early on with a guy on radio describing something horrifying and you find him dead, even if you book it with maximum speed. From there, the next plot point is a nice big cargo ship that appears to be frosted over. An alien actually appears and takes off with one of your squad mates, Jester. Again, maximum speed is useless, scripted events and all that. He dies, and later on, Prophet is likewise grabbed by an alien. In Dr. Rosenthal's research complex, there's a fossil of essentially the same creature that swiped Jester and Prophet. Naturally, the fossil isn't quite so dead and kills Rosenthal by freezing him. Nomad survives this and ends up running into 4 NK soldiers wearing their own improvised version of the nanosuit. Not as good as yours, of course, but it shows that they are reverse engineering the tech, which could be trouble. In one of those lovely, you're invincible during gameplay but weak during a cutscene, you're captured by Kyong. Kyong blows open the entrance to an alien structure, which proves to be his undoing because the wave kills his men and re-energizes Nomad's suit. Taking care of Kyong, Nomad has to fight through this alien structure. I should probably mention that on the way to the research complex he met Rosenthal's daughter, Helena, and she's able to evacuate but Nomad's stuck. Making it out of the alien structure, Nomad finds himself inside a sphere where temperatures are insanely low. He runs into Prophet, who had survived the alien plucking, but his nanosuit malfunctions and he's at risk of freezing to death. Jumping from heat source to keep warm, they do manage to make it out of the sphere of frost before Prophet turns into a block of ice. Fighting through aliens at last, a ride off the island is made available, although Nomad is forced to pilot the ship. Making it onto a large naval vessel, Prophet and Nomad are looked at with a totally not Chekhov's gun ultimate weapon being teased in the process. The Admiral decides he wants to nuke the island to get rid of the aliens, but Helena warns that they might feed off the energy and grow even stronger. For some reason, Prophet decides to desert and head back to the island, and the Admiral doesn't listen, so he launches the nuke anyway. Now obviously, the Admiral's military experience and intuition proves to pay off, and while Prophet tragically dies in the nuclear explosion, the aliens are at last obliterated. Just kidding, the expected happens and the aliens grow stronger from the blast. Thus begins a massive invasion, and they've got their hands full just trying to fend them off. Eventually, a massive mothership shows up, and the totally not Chekhov's gun from earlier plays its obvious role as Nomad shoots it down from the sky before escaping with the others. It ends with such a shocking and totally not obvious bombshell that Prophet's actually alive. Okay, let's be real, the plot isn't the most unexpected or unpredictable here. I'm sure even back when the game released, the elements were fairly on the cliche side. The daughter of a brilliant researcher being corrected, the arrogant admiral being wrong, the buddy commander who bails and it turns out is right to do so. I haven't played any of the other Crysis games, but at least it was interesting in a way to leave things off since the aliens appear to have only begun their big invasion. It may not have been an especially surprising story, but at least it was thrilling enough to get me through it. That and the surprisingly fun gameplay had me clamoring for more just to see what would happen next, so it does its job. It definitely fulfills Carmack's old ideal of a video game story in that it's not super important. It gives proper context to things and it could be a lot worse. With some video games nowadays where the story is actually a huge detriment to the gameplay, last of us too, it's always good to have one where the story at least doesn't trip over itself. Let's be real, this is probably the section of the review you were all waiting for. This is what Crysis is famous for, the PC killer that was way ahead of its time in terms of graphics. The expected thing would probably be that since it's a game released in 2007, it would be horribly dated by now. However, I'm pleased to report that is not the case. While some effects obviously aren't as robust as they could be and apparently isn't as well optimized for CPUs because they thought core speed would keep climbing, it holds up better than you would think. One thing I thought aged very poorly about games around the time is that they went for a sepia golden brown tone, something that Crysis thankfully avoids even in the PS3 and 360 versions. Throughout the majority of the game, it has some very saturated and lush colors, mostly greens and blues with a green foliage as well as blue skies and oceans providing a very pretty picture to look at. That being said, I have a word of caution, do not play it on low settings. While nowadays even very cheap hardware should be able to handle this game on very high settings, medium should be bare minimum. Medium at least approximates the look of higher settings, albeit very stripped in quality. Low is just devoid of many things vital to the image, such as normal mapping, bloom, post-processing, and even shadow casting. On low, the water straight up looks like a bad mirror and everything just looks flat. So you obviously want on very high, and that's where it truly shines. Specular highlights, normal maps, foliage swaying in the wind, water caustics, even god rays shining through the trees all add to the gorgeous presentation. There are also some very nice particle effects on display. It's certainly satisfying making something blow up with the accompanying bright flash and smoke that really add a punch to it. While textures can look a touch blurry and some post-processing effects can look a touch dated if you look at them up close, it's something you have to go out of your way to really notice. Even something you would think for sure would age poorly because it's hard to get right, humans look surprisingly good even today. You've got plenty of opportunities to see them up close too, either in cutscenes or using maximum strength to grab someone as a meat shield. It's not often that realistic faces can avoid the uncanny valley, especially older games. I'd consider Half-Life 2 probably the best example of it done right. While it's obviously not going to hold up compared to a game that just released this year, Crysis is definitely another fine example and has overall noticeably higher amounts of detail too, so it arguably holds up even better than Half-Life 2. Now, as beautiful as the lush jungles and oceans are, I'm thankful that that isn't the entire game. You do eventually end up in an alien structure where the greens and blues give way to a mix of rocky caverns and crystal structures and then to a very metallic alien core that you're flying through, complete with transparent blue shields. Then, of course, there's the sphere where everything's a winter wonderland. As with Dark Souls 3, I always appreciate a good snowstorm to shake things up from the usual, and it does a very good job of making you feel like your blood might freeze over at any second. It almost makes you feel relieved when you get out of it and back into the luscious greens. I've gushed about the game's graphics, but really the audio isn't so bad either. Music is actually pretty rare, and typically in select circumstances like the opening that shows off the suit powers. For the most part, even during fights, it's all atmospheric ambiance. I assume that's a result of making the game feel as realistic as possible, and perhaps it's for the best as it allows you to hear things like wind gently breezing or the waves crashing against the shore. The voice acting honestly isn't half bad either. James Meredith steals the show with the team commander Prophet, and the supporting cast like the misguided Admiral, Helena, and the other men, including your guy Nomad, are also very serviceable. Your nano suit even has a voice, albeit thankfully very short snippets. I love Half-Life to death, but the suit constantly updating to the point that it has to repeat things just to update numbers can be very tiring. Just having a simple voice saying maximum this or cloak engage that when switching suit powers will suffice. As you well know, I'm not good with judging sound effects. They weren't distractingly bad, so they get the thumbs up from me. Really though, sound effects are like janitor maintenance. They do their job best really when you don't notice much at all. Guns and explosions do sound appropriately beefy, so it adds to the overall fun there. Overall, Crysis earns its reputation as the great PC killer. For being an over 13-year-old game, it holds up surprisingly well and would at the very least pass for a AA game. Mostly it's aged in terms of post-processing effects becoming tighter and VRAM allowing for higher quality textures, but you really have to be looking for them to begin with. It looks and sounds spectacular, although I have no doubt the remaster looks even better, so that's an option as of recently. Crysis has been known mostly as the PC killer, and while that has some merit, I also think the game has a lot more to offer than that. The suit powers are a lot of fun to abuse, the voice acting and ambiance really add to each scene, and any gripes are fairly minimal. Even if the plot is a little predictable, that didn't stop it from being a wild ride from start to finish, and I'd recommend it even past its graphics. Still though, you want them on very high to get the most out of it, but even if you can, I'd still say to give the game a shot. Crysis actually has something that's becoming frustratingly uncommon these days, a playable demo, so you can see for yourself if you'll like it enough to warrant the full game. This has been my review of Crysis for the PC. Thank you so much for tuning in with me. Let's Plays are every day at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. and I've got a live stream tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. all Eastern Standard Time, so I'll see you then.